Get out! Get out of my house now!" Richard Sterling's voice, a rasp of pure agony, tore through the opulent silence of the mansion. His usually immaculate suit was rumpled, his eyes wild with a grief that bordered on madness, as he loomed over the small, still figure of Elias Jones. "My daughter, Lily. She's worse. The doctors, they were right all along this. This sunshine and whispers of yours, it's harming her. You gave us false hope." The boy, Elias, clutched his worn satchel, his young face pale. But amidst the storm of the billionaire's despair, his gaze looking up at the towering, heartbroken man remained strangely, unnervingly steady. He didn't flinch. What unspoken truth lies behind those steady eyes, and how will Richard react to what seems like the ultimate betrayal of hope? Share your thoughts on what happens next in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a moment of this unforgettable journey. Richard Sterling, a name etched onto the city's skyline in steel and glass, surveyed his domain from the 40th floor. His office, a symphony of muted greys and polished chrome, was a testament to a life built on precision, on control. Every minute of his day was scheduled, every deal, calculated every outcome, anticipated. He was the boss, not just of Sterling Industries, but of his own meticulously crafted destiny. Or so he had believed, until destiny had delivered a blow no ledger could account for, no strategy could mitigate. His daughter, Lily. The name itself was a whisper of fragility in the otherwise resonant chamber of his life. 8 years old, with eyes that once mirrored the boundless blue of a summer sky, now often clouded with a quiet, unchildlike resignation. For 3 years since the accident, Richard's mind always skittered away from the details, the screech of tires, the rain-slicked road, his own frantic, useless dash. For 3 years, Lily's legs had remained still, lifeless, a cruel, unyielding sentence passed down by fate and confirmed by a procession of the world's finest medical minds. Each one, with their gentle, regretful tones, had offered prognoses that felt like nails hammered into the coffin of his hope. His vast wealth, the power that could bend markets and summon kings of industry, was utterly impotent against the silence in Lily's limbs. The sprawling mansion, once filled with her laughter as she chased sunbeams across the marble floors, now echoed with a hushed solemnity. Nurses moved with quiet efficiency. Therapists offered regimens that yielded nothing but deeper furrows on Richard's brow. He'd poured millions into research, into experimental treatments, chasing any phantom of a cure. All that remained was the hollow ache of a father's love, a love so fierce it felt like a constant burning wound in his chest, a love that could do nothing. Absolutely nothing. His control, the very bedrock of his existence, had crumbled where it mattered most. He found himself increasingly short-tempered with his staff, his meticulous plans feeling like a mockery. What was the point of conquering the world if he couldn't even help his own child take a single step? The guilt, a shadowy companion, whispered that perhaps his relentless ambition, the countless hours stolen from her childhood, had somehow invited this tragedy. It was an irrational thought, he knew, but grief and guilt were seldom rational partners. That afternoon, Richard carried Lily from the car into the towering edifice of the Children's Advanced Neuro-Rehabilitation Institute. Another specialist. Another round of sterile reassurances and complex jargon that all amounted to the same heartbreaking conclusion: prepare for a lifetime of this. Lily was light in his arms, too light. Her head rested against his shoulder, her small hand clutching his lapel, a silent, trusting weight. He navigated the familiar sterile corridors, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed ahead, a mask of composed authority that barely concealed the chasm of despair within. As they neared the grand entrance on their way out, The sun, weak and autumnal, cast long shadows. Most people hurried by, lost in their own worlds of worry and purpose. Richard was no different. He was already mentally rehearsing the call to his London office, the points he needed to make the decisions that wouldn't wait, when a small voice, surprisingly clear and steady, cut through the city's hum. Sir Richard, mid-stride, almost ignored it. Another plea for a handout, no doubt. He had a foundation for that. His assistant handled such things. But the boy, for it was a boy, stepped directly into his path. Not with a cup or a downcast gaze, but with an unnerving stillness. He was small, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, dressed in clothes that were clean, but clearly too large, the sleeves of a worn jacket rolled up to reveal thin wrists. His shoes, scuffed and battered, had a piece of silver duct tape across the toe of one. A faded blue beanie was pulled low over a shock of dark, unruly hair, from under which a pair of startlingly intelligent eyes met Richard's. This was Elias Jones, though Richard wouldn't know his name for some time yet. Elias, a child of the streets, whose university had been hardship, whose professors had been observation, and the whispered wisdom of a mother long gone. Richard's first instinct was irritation, an obstacle, an unscheduled interruption. He adjusted Lily in his arms, ready to sidestep. Then Elias spoke again, his voice devoid of any tremor, any plea. It was a statement calm and certain, delivered with an almost adult gravity that seemed utterly out of place in such a small, impoverished frame. Sir Elias repeated his gaze, unwavering, locking onto Richard's, with an intensity that was both disconcerting and compelling. "I can make your daughter walk again." The words hung in the air, stark and impossible. Around them the city's rhythm continued, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of conversations, the shuffle of feet. But for Richard Sterling in that precise moment, everything contracted to the space between himself and this poor boy. His daughter Lily stirred slightly in his arms, her head lifting a fraction, as if she, too, had registered the extraordinary claim. Right Richard thought a flicker of dry, incredulous humor brushing against the raw edge of his pain. And next he'll tell me he can make the market triple by Tuesday, with a handful of pebbles and a well-placed wish. It was the reflexive cynicism of a man who dealt in facts, in figures, in tangible results, confronted by something so utterly beyond the realm of his experience, so wildly, pathetically audacious. Yet the boy didn't waver. He didn't look away. There was no hint of deceit in those clear, direct eyes, no trace of the usual cunning one might expect from a child trying to wheedle money from a wealthy stranger. There was only that same quiet, profound conviction. Richard Sterling, the man who commanded boardrooms and brokered empires, the man whose pronouncements could shift fortunes, found his own voice had deserted him. He just stood there, Lily a precious, fragile weight against his chest, the audacious words of a poor boy echoing in the sudden roaring silence of his mind. He just stood there frozen. The dismissal was sharp, almost reflexive. Richard had muttered something about not having time for foolishness, his voice a low growl, and had swept past Elias Lily, clutched tightly as if to shield her from such an outlandish pronouncement. He'd deposited Lily with her nurse, barked a few orders to his driver, and tried to plunge back into the calculated world of Sterling Industries. But the boy's eyes and his words had lodged themselves in Richard's mind like a splinter of glass, too small to be a genuine threat, yet too sharp to ignore. "I can make your daughter walk again." The sheer, unadulterated certainty of it. Through high-stakes negotiations and strategy meetings that afternoon, the phrase echoed an unwelcome counterpoint to the clipped, precise language of business. He found himself staring out the panoramic window, not at the sprawling city he'd conquered, but at the memory of a small, determined face and duct-taped shoes. It was absurd, utterly patently absurd. Children didn't cure paralysis. Beggar boys didn't possess secrets unknown to the legions of specialists he'd consulted. And yet, what if the question, insidious and persistent, wormed its way through the barricades of his logic? He'd exhausted every avenue, hadn't he? What was left but the dregs of hope, so diluted it was almost indistinguishable from despair. That evening, unable to concentrate on the quarterly reports that usually held his rapt attention, Richard made a call. Not to another renowned neurologist, but to a private investigator he kept on retainer, a man named Peterson, whose discretion was as legendary as his ability to unearth anything or anyone. The instructions were vague. A boy around 9 or 10, often seen near the Children's Institute, distinctive worn clothing, a quiet demeanor. Find out who he was, where he came from. Richard didn't specify why. He wasn't sure he knew himself. Peterson reported back within 48 hours. The boy was Elias Jones, orphaned. His mother, Sarah Jones, had passed away 2 years prior. They'd lived in the city's poorest district, the forgotten labyrinth of neglected tenements and struggling families. There were no official records of Sarah Jones being a medical professional, but Peterson, thorough as ever, had spoken to people in that neighborhood. They remembered Sarah. They spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, a woman with healing hands, a quiet wisdom about herbs and the body's natural rhythms. She'd eased the pain of the old mended, the hurts of the young, and had a peculiar knack for helping those the hospitals had given up on. Not with miracles, they said, but with patience, with an understanding that seemed to go deeper than medicine, and her son Elias had always been by her side, watching, absorbing. Richard listened to the report, a knot tightening in his stomach. Inherited folk knowledge, a child's fantasy built on a mother's memory. It was still preposterous. But the alternative, the continued silence in Lily's legs, the slow fade of her childhood spirit, was a daily torment. He found Elias 2 days later, sitting on an upturned crate by a neglected park fountain, sketching in a battered notebook. Richard Sterling, CEO, a man whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per minute, approached the boy who owned nothing but the clothes on his back and an impossible conviction. Elias Jones. Richard's voice was gruff, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Elias looked up, his gaze as direct and unnervingly calm as before. He simply nodded. I've thought about what you said. Richard felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. This was uncharted territory. It's highly improbable. Walking is natural, Sir Elias replied, his voice soft. Sometimes the body just forgets the way, or something blocks the path. Richard's internal monologue was already in overdrive. Blocks the path. Is this boy a spiritual guru now, or a junior league philosopher? He cleared his throat. What exactly do you propose to do? What? Methods. Elias gestured vaguely. Sunshine, good air, helping the legs remember. My mother taught me. Your mother was not a doctor. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. A fact Richard was clinging to. No, Sir Elias agreed without a trace of defensiveness. She just helped people feel whole again. Richard stared at the boy, at the earnest sincerity in his face. He thought of Lily, of the sterile, white rooms, the gleaming, indifferent machines. He thought of the word, whole. What did he have to lose his dignity that had already taken a battering against the unyielding wall of Lily's condition? His money, he'd spent fortunes for less than a whisper of hope. All right, boy, Richard said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. One chance, one session. Here, tomorrow, noon. He felt the need to assert some control. You'll follow my rules. My security will be present. No. Strange rituals. If I see anything that I deem harmful, or even questionable, it stops. Immediately. Is that understood? Elias simply nodded again, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. Understood, sir. The next day at precisely noon, Richard was at the park. His driver and a discreet security guard stood a respectful distance away. Lily was in her lightweight wheelchair, a soft blanket over her legs, her expression curious but passive. Elias was already there, a small worn satchel at his feet. He greeted Lily with a gentle, "Hello, Lily," and she offered a shy, hesitant smile in return. Richard's arms crossed every inch. The boss watched with an eagle eye as Elias knelt beside Lily. The boy didn't produce any strange instruments, no mystical charms. He simply took Lily's small, pale foot in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle yet firm. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening. Then he began to move her ankle in slow, deliberate circles, his other hand resting lightly on her calf. He hummed a low, tuneless melody, something that sounded ancient and soothing. Richard found himself holding his breath. It was all so anticlimactic, so simple. He'd expected. He didn't know what he'd expected. Chanting incense, at the very least some dramatic pronouncements. This was just a boy humming and gently moving his daughter's foot. This is ridiculous, he thought, his skepticism surging. I'm a grown man, a CIO standing in a public park, entrusting my daughter to this performance art. Elias worked in silence for nearly an hour, moving from her ankles to her knees, then her hips, his movements rhythmic, unhurried. He spoke to Lily occasionally, not about healing, but about clouds, about the color of a robin's breast, about the way a seed felt in her hand. Richard noticed Lily's eyes, usually so distant, were fixed on Elias's face, a flicker of something. Engagement. Then, as Elias was gently massaging the sole of Lily's left foot, his thumb pressing into a point near her toes, Lily's brow furrowed slightly. A tiny, almost invisible tremor ran through her foot. So small, so fleeting, Richard would have dismissed it as a muscle twitch, a trick of the light had he not been staring with such desperate intensity. Elias paused. He looked up not at Richard, but at Lily. Did you feel that, Lily? A little tickle. Lily's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She didn't speak, but her lips parted slightly. Elias then turned to Richard, his expression unreadable. The path isn't completely closed, sir. Richard said nothing. He looked at Lily's foot, still held in Elias's hand. Had he imagined it? That tiny flutter. His logical mind screamed, coincidence. His heart, that battered desperate organ, dared to whisper a single treacherous word, hope. The battle within him had just found a new, bewildering front. The fragile seed of hope, planted by that almost imperceptible tremor in Lily's foot, was a dangerous thing. Richard Sterling knew it. Hope, in his experience, was often the prelude to a deeper, more bitter disappointment. He tried to dismiss what he'd seen, what Elias had so calmly asserted. A nerve spasm. A father's wishful thinking. Yet he couldn't quite extinguish the ember. He agreed to another session, then another, always in the quiet, sun-dappled corner of the park, away from prying eyes. Away, he'd thought, from the judgment of a world that would surely deem him mad. He was wrong. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man who considered himself the very embodiment of medical reason and decorum, chief of pediatric neurology at the city's most prestigious hospital, with a string of publications and a waiting list that snaked around the block. He was not accustomed to his treatment plans being supplemented, especially not by a 9-year-old of no fixed address with a penchant for humming, and what Dr. Finch could only describe with a delicate shudder as unsubstantiated manual manipulations. The news reached him, as news often did in their rarefied circles, through a concerned colleague, a whisper at a charity gala. Richard Sterling, a man of considerable intellect and influence, was apparently allowing some street urchin to perform therapy on his paralyzed daughter. Dr. Finch arrived at Sterling Manor unannounced the following afternoon, his Savile Row suit a stark contrast to the lived-in comfort of the family's private wing. He found Richard in the sunroom, observing Elias, who was patiently showing Lily how to trace patterns with her fingers in a tray of smooth, cool sand. Lily, propped up with cushions, was actually smiling a genuine if faint upturn of her lips. Richard Dr. Finch began, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "I must confess I am perplexed by certain reports I've heard." Richard, startled, rose to his feet. "Alistair, this is unexpected." "Indeed," Dr. Finch said, his gaze flicking dismissively towards Elias, then lingering on Lily with an expression of professional concern that Richard suddenly found grating. "I've been informed that you're permitting an unqualified individual to interfere with Lily's prescribed regimen." Elias, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quietly continued his work with Lily, his small back to the two men. "Elias is not interfering, Alistair. He is offering a different approach." Richard found himself on the defensive, a position he loathed. "Doctor," Finch raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "A different approach, Richard. With all due respect, this child is engaging in what amounts to folk remedies. Hope is a powerful sedative, I understand, but we must not abandon scientific rigor for wishful thinking performed by a minor." His tone was condescending, paternalistic. Richard felt a flush of anger. And what has scientific rigor achieved for Lily these past 3 years? Alistair, beyond confirming her paralysis with ever-increasing certainty. "These things take time," Dr. Finch intoned. "There are protocols. We are exploring new avenues constantly. This is charlatanism. It's potentially dangerous. You, as Lily's father, have a responsibility." "I am well aware of my responsibilities," Richard cut in, his voice dangerously low. And one of them, he thought, a surprising wave of protectiveness towards the small, quiet boy washing over him, is apparently to endure lectures from men who've achieved precisely nothing for my daughter, while looking down their noses at anyone who dares to try something different. The confrontations continued over the following weeks. Dr. Finch, armed with studies and statistics, would corner Richard at his office at the club, even phoning him at ungodly hours. He painted Elias as a charlatan, a delusion Richard was projecting onto his desperate situation. He hinted at professional repercussions at questions being asked about Richard's judgment, not just as a father, but as the head of a global corporation. "Richard, people are talking," Finch warned one afternoon, his voice like silk wrapping around a shard of ice. "A man in your position, dabbling in such fringe practices. It doesn't inspire confidence." Elias, meanwhile, remained steadfast. He never spoke of Doctor. Finch never acknowledged the storm brewing around him. His focus was solely on Lily. He'd bring her smooth stones, warmed by the sun, teaching her to feel their texture. He'd crush fragrant leaves between his fingers, encouraging her to identify their scent. He'd have her listen to the songs of different birds. It was a therapy of the senses, of gentle reawakening. And Lily? Lily was changing. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. But the shadows in her eyes were receding. She was more alert, more engaged. One afternoon, as Elias was gently rotating her ankle, Lily giggled. A small, breathy sound, but a giggle nonetheless. Richard, who had been pacing nearby, stopped dead. He hadn't heard her giggle in 3 years. "What was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Elias looked up, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I think Mr. Sterling." She felt the feather I just brushed against her foot. He held up a tiny blue jay feather. "Doctor." Finch, had he been there, would have called it a reflex, a neurological anomaly. Richard, however, saw his daughter's eyes bright with a spark he'd thought extinguished forever. The pressure from Dr. Finch, however, was becoming untenable. He was now threatening to make a formal report to the medical board about Richard's endangerment of Lily by exposing her to an unlicensed practitioner. The implication was clear: cease this nonsense or face public scandal. Richard's board members, catching wind of the eccentricity, were beginning to murmur. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study, the weight of the world on his shoulders. On one hand, the tangible, albeit tiny, improvements in Lily, her increased animation, the rare giggle, the way her eyes now followed Elias with an almost worshipful attention. On the other, the full weight of the established medical world, the threat to his reputation, the ingrained logic that screamed, this was all a foolish, desperate dream. He called Elias to his study. The boy entered quietly, his gaze steady. Elias Richard began the formality a shield. "Dr. Finch is insistent. He believes what you are doing is harmful." Elias said nothing, simply waited. He is a respected physician. His opinion carries weight. Richard found it difficult to meet the boy's direct gaze. "There are potential consequences. For me. For my company." Still, Elias was silent, his small hands clasped loosely in front of him. It was this very stillness, this lack of any attempt to plead or persuade, that Richard found both infuriating and profoundly affecting. "What I'm saying, Elias, is that this is becoming very complicated." Richard ran a hand through his hair. He felt like a man trying to hold water. I need more. More than a feather, more than a giggle. I need something definitive." Elias tilted his head, a gesture Richard was coming to recognize as a prelude to some surprisingly insightful statement. "Sir," he said, his voice soft but clear, "is Lily happier?" The question in its simplicity disarmed Richard. Happier. Yes, undeniably. More present, more alive. Was that not definitive enough? But happiness doesn't make legs move, Elias. Richard said, the weariness evident in his voice. Perhaps not, Sir Elias conceded. But perhaps it helps the legs want to move. Richard looked at the boy, at the unshakable faith in those young eyes. Against all reason, against all evidence to the contrary presented by the learned Dr. Finch Richard Sterling, the boss made a decision. It was a whisper of defiance against a roaring chorus of doubt. "All right, Elias," he said, a new resolve hardening his features. "We continue, for now. But understand this, the moment I believe Lily is at any risk or that this is leading nowhere, it ends. And Dr. Finch will have his way." Elias merely nodded, that almost imperceptible smile returning. "I understand, Mr. Sterling. We just need a little more sunshine." Richard almost scoffed. Sunshine. If only it were that simple. But as Elias left the study, leaving behind an aura of quiet certainty, Richard Sterling felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. It wasn't quite belief, not yet. But it was a fierce, desperate determination to protect the flicker of hope this impossible boy had ignited in the cold, sterile darkness of his world. The fight he knew was far from over. It had just taken a very unexpected turn. The precarious truce Richard had brokered with his own skepticism and with the formidable Dr. Finch lasted for 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of Elias's quiet ministrations, of Lily's slow, almost imperceptible awakening. There were more smiles, a brighter engagement in her eyes. She'd even begun to utter a few soft words, tentative explorations of sound after long disuse. Richard found himself clinging to these moments, replaying them in his mind like precious, hoarded jewels. He'd started to push back, albeit gently, against Dr. Finch's dire pronouncements, armed with these tiny shards of progress. Then came the storm. It began subtly, a return of Lily's former lethargy, a dimming of that newfound light in her eyes. The small sounds she'd begun to make faded back into silence. Her appetite waned. Within days, it was as if the past month had been a dream, a cruel illusion. Richard's carefully nurtured hope withered. Dr. Finch, informed by a worried nurse who reported Lily's regression, arrived at Stirling Manor like a vulture circling a dying animal. His examination was thorough, his expression grave. Afterwards, in Richard's study, he delivered his verdict with a somber finality that Richard found himself too defeated to contest. Richard Finch began his voice, a low thrum of clinical authority, mixed with a carefully measured dose of sympathy. As I feared, this unregulated experimentation has had consequences. Lily's system is stressed. Her baseline vitals have dipped. We were making steady if slow progress with the conventional protocols. This deviation has, I'm afraid, set her back considerably. He paused, letting his words sink in. It's imperative we cease this boy's activities immediately and return to a medically sound course of treatment before more harm is done. Each word was a hammer blow to Richard's already fractured spirit. Guilt, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He had endangered his child, allowed his desperation to override his reason. He'd been a fool chasing a fairy tale peddled by a street child. The fleeting moments of Lily's improvement now seemed like random fluctuations, misinterpreted by a father's desperate heart. "You're right, Alistair," Richard said, the fight draining out of him. His voice was hollow. I was wrong. I let hope cloud my judgment. Stop whatever you need to stop. Just help her. He felt a profound weariness, the weight of his failure crushing him. He was the boss, the man who controlled empires, yet he couldn't even protect his own daughter from his own foolishness. Internally, a bitter, almost hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up. Master of the universe undone by a boy with duct-taped shoes and a handful of sunshine. Perfect. Dr. Finch nodded, his expression softening into one of magnanimous understanding. "It's a natural mistake, Richard. The stress you've been under. Anyone would grasp at straws. We'll get her stabilized. We'll get her back on track." He exuded a calm, reassuring confidence that only weeks ago Richard had found insufferable. Now it felt like a lifeline. When Elias arrived later that afternoon, Richard met him at the door to Lily's wing. The boy took one look at Richard's face and seemed to understand. Mr. Stirling, Eli's voice was barely a whisper. Elias, Richard began the words, heavy tasting of ash. "I'm afraid we can't continue. Lily, she's not doing well. Dr. Finch believes your methods are detrimental." Elias looked past Richard towards Lily's room. His small face was etched with a sorrow that seemed too profound for his years. He didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply nodded slowly, his eyes, usually so bright with an inner light, now clouded with a deep, empathetic pain. May I see her just for a moment?" Elias asked, his voice still quiet. Richard hesitated. Finch's warnings echoed in his ears, but the raw, unfeigned grief in the boy's expression moved him. What harm could one last moment do, all right, Elias? But just for a moment. And no treatments. Just say goodbye. Elias walked into Lily's room. She lay in her bed, pale and still, her eyes closed. The vibrant engagement of the past weeks was gone. Elias didn't approach the bed immediately. He stood by the window looking out at the fading afternoon light. Then he turned not to Lily, but to Richard, who had followed him in his heart, a leaden weight. "Mr. Sterling," Elias said, his voice soft but carrying an unexpected resonance. "My mother, Sarah. She used to say that sometimes the body gets tired of fighting, not because it wants to give up, but because it forgets what it's fighting for." He paused, his gaze distant, as if seeing something Richard could not. "She told me about the village well back where her own grandmother lived. It dried up one summer. Everyone said it was finished, that the spring was dead. They were ready to abandon it." Richard listened, a strange compulsion keeping him silent. This was not a plea, not an argument. It was something else. But her grandmother, Elias, continued, his eyes now focusing on Richard. She didn't believe it. Every day she'd go to the well. She wouldn't try to draw water. She'd just sit, and she'd sing to it. Old songs about the rain, about the cool, deep earth. People thought she was mad. Elias's lips curved in a faint, sad smile. She sang for weeks. And then one morning, there was water. Just a little at first. But it came back, because my mother said her grandmother reminded the well of its own song. Elias turned then and walked to Lily's bedside. He didn't touch her. He simply sat on the small chair beside her bed, took her small, unresponsive hand gently in his own, and began to hum. It was the same low, tuneless melody Richard had heard in the park, ancient, soothing a sound that seemed to resonate with the very marrow of one's bones. He hummed for a long time, his eyes closed, his face serene. Richard watched his resolve to end this wavering, Dr. Finch's pronouncements, the weight of medical science, his own crushing guilt. All seemed to recede slightly in the face of this boy's unwavering, almost holy calm. Then Elias began to speak to Lily, his voice a soft murmur. "Lily, do you remember the sunshine? How warm it felt on your face? Do you remember the blue jay's feather, so soft, and the color of the sky after a storm?" He wasn't asking for a response. He was simply reminding, painting pictures with his words, evoking sensations. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a change came over Lily. A tiny furrow eased from her brow. Her breathing, which had been shallow, seemed to deepen slightly. Then her eyelids fluttered. Once. Twice. Richard held his breath. Coincidence. It had to be. Elias continued, his voice weaving a tapestry of gentle memories. And the sand lily, cool and smooth between your fingers, like the beach where the waves sing their own song. Lily's fingers, the ones interlaced with Elias's, twitched, not a spasm, a definite, deliberate movement, a squeeze. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. He took a step closer. Then Lily's eyes opened. Not just fluttered, but opened. And they weren't dull or distant. They were focused. They were looking directly at Elias. A tiny, tremulous smile touched her lips. And then a sound. A word. So faint, Richard almost missed it. Li. It was the barest whisper, but it was her voice. Clear. Intentional. Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. He stumbled forward, his hand outstretched, not quite believing what he was seeing, what he was hearing. He looked from Lily's face now, alight with a fragile awareness, to Elias, whose eyes were shining with unshed tears. At that precise moment, the door opened, and Dr. Alistair Finch stepped in, an air of brisk professional authority about him. Richard had scheduled an immediate... He stopped short, taking in the scene. Lily awake, her eyes open, a faint smile on her lips, her hand holding the poor boy's. Richard standing over them, his face a mask of stunned, disbelieving awe. Dr. Finch cleared his throat, his composure momentarily shaken. "Well, it appears Miss Sterling is having a moment of improved lucidity. This can happen. A temporary rally." Richard turned his gaze, usually so cool and commanding, now blazing with a fire Finch had never seen. The weariness, the guilt, the despair, all of it was suddenly burned away, replaced by a white-hot certainty. Temporary Alistair Richard's voice was dangerously quiet, cutting through Finch's clinical assessment like a scalpel. "A rally, my daughter just spoke. She just smiled. After you and a dozen like you told me she was regressing, after you told me Richard gestured towards Elias was harming her. He took a step towards Dr. Finch, no longer the defeated guilt-ridden father, but the boss in full formidable command. "Get out, Alistair." Finch blinked, his professional mask cracking. "Richard, I must insist. This is highly irregular." I said, "Get out." Richard's voice was no longer quiet. It was a roar echoing with months of pent-up frustration, of dashed hopes, and now of a ferocious, undeniable belief. "You will not come near my daughter again. You will not question this boy again. You are dismissed, Alistair, from this house, from her case, permanently." "Doctor..." Alistair Finch, for the first time in his illustrious career, found himself utterly speechless. He stared at Richard, then at the small boy, then at the girl in the bed, who was impossibly still smiling. He opened his mouth, then closed it, turned on his heel, and walked out the door, clicking shut behind him with an air of stunned finality. Richard turned back to the bed, his legs trembling. He sank to his knees beside Lily, his gaze fixed on her face, on the undeniable light that had returned to her eyes. He looked at Elias, whose small hand was still enfolded in Lily's. The boy offered a small, tired but radiant smile. The path, it seemed, was not only open, it was for the first time in 3 long years illuminated. The dismissal of Dr. Alistair Finch was not a quiet affair. A man of his stature, his ego did not simply slink away into obscurity. The whispers started almost immediately, then escalated into a full-blown media squall. Anonymous sources, clearly Finch himself or his close associates, began feeding stories to opportunistic journalists. Billionaire CEO risks daughter's life with mystic child healer. Sterling Industries, chief under undue influence. Questions raised over Richard Sterling's stability. Finch cunningly didn't stop there. He or those acting for him delved into Elias's past, into the life of Sarah Jones. Soon old, half-forgotten, local news clippings from the city's poorer districts were resurrected. Sarah Jones was painted not as a gentle community healer, but as an unlicensed quack, a woman who had faced minor legal challenges for her unorthodox methods, though no serious harm had ever been proven. Elias, by extension, was portrayed as either a victim of his mother's delusions or a disturbingly astute charlatan in miniature. Richard found himself besieged. His board members at Sterling Industries, already unsettled by prior rumors, were now openly alarmed. An emergency meeting was called. His phone rang incessantly, with calls from concerned and some not-so-concerned friends, business associates and rivals, all offering advice, veiled threats, or thinly disguised schadenfreude. The meticulously ordered world Richard Sterling had built was threatening to shatter around him. He tried to shield Lily and Elias from the worst of it, but the tension in the house was palpable. Elias, though quiet, seemed to carry an added weight on his small shoulders. He'd seen the news reports flickering on a television in the staff lounge, had caught snippets of hushed, worried conversations. Yet he continued his work with Lily, his focus a small, steady flame in the encroaching storm. One evening, as Richard sat in his study, the latest headline screaming from his tablet, "Sterling's Miracle Boy Legacy of Deception," His chief legal counsel, Arthur Hayes, a man who had navigated Richard through countless corporate battles, laid out the grim reality. Richard Arthur said, his voice carefully neutral, "The board is agitated. They're talking about invoking the executive capacity clause. They want you to issue a public statement, disavowing the boy, reaffirming your commitment to, let's call it, established medical practices. They see this as a PR nightmare, damaging shareholder value. And if I refuse," Richard asked, his voice flat, "they could move to have you temporarily suspended, pending an evaluation." Arthur didn't need to elaborate. Richard felt a cold fury rise within him. So this was it. His empire, his life's work, threatened because he dared to hope for his daughter, because he dared to trust a poor boy over the pronouncements of a vindictive, humiliated physician. But as he was about to unleash a tirade, another memory surfaced, a far more damning one. It was triggered by a detail in one of Peterson's earlier, more comprehensive reports on Sarah Jones's neighborhood, a forgotten industrial zone bordering their District Zone 7, owned by a subsidiary of Sterling Industries. Years ago there had been complaints, environmental concerns, waste disposal issues. Richard had delegated it, signed off on some cost-cutting measures recommended by his then COO, eager to maximize profits on an underperforming asset. The issue had faded from his radar, dismissed as minor activist grumbling, now staring at the picture of Sarah Jones in an old newspaper clipping, a kind, tired face, standing in front of a dilapidated community center in that very district. A sickening realization began to dawn. He tasked Peterson urgently to cross-reference timelines, Sarah Jones's community work, the period of increased illnesses reported anecdotally in Zone 7, and the operational period of Sterling Industries' cost-cutting measures at their adjacent facility. The pieces fell into place with horrifying speed. Peterson's follow-up was swift and brutal. There was no smoking gun, no direct lawsuit that had reached Richard's desk, but a pattern of anecdotal evidence of local health reports showing a spike in respiratory illnesses and other ailments in Sarah Jones's community during the years Sterling Industries' subsidiary had been operating under those optimized waste protocols. Sarah Jones herself had been one of the community advocates trying to raise alarm, largely ignored by city officials more interested in Sterling Industries' tax revenue. The truth, when it fully hit Richard, was a physical blow. His pursuit of profit, his delegation without sufficient oversight, his dismissal of minor concerns might have contributed to the very suffering in the community that Sarah Jones had dedicated her life to alleviating. Had his company's actions, however indirectly, played a part in the hardships that defined Elias's young life, perhaps even in Sarah's early death, if her health had been compromised? The weight of it was crushing. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about his own integrity, his own complicity in a system that valued profit over people. The attacks on Elias, on Sarah Jones, now felt like a grotesque karmic reflection of his own past indifference. He sat in his study for hours, the city lights blurring through the window, the empire he built feeling like a gilded cage. He could issue the statement. He could sacrifice Elias, salvage his reputation, protect his company. It would be the logical, business-savvy thing to do. Appease the board, silence the media, and return to the sterile, predictable world of medicine for Lily, however hopeless. Or he could choose a different path. A harder path. The next morning, Richard Sterling called a press conference, not in the sterile confines of Sterling Industries, but in the small, slightly overgrown community garden adjacent to the park where Elias had first worked with Lily. He stood before the throng of reporters, not as the imperious CEO, but as a father and as a man reckoning with his own conscience. Eloa stood quietly a little distance away, holding Lily's hand. Lily herself sat in her wheelchair, but her eyes were bright alert. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady, resonating with a newfound conviction. "You've all read the stories. You've heard the accusations. About me, about this young boy, Elias Jones, and about his mother, Sarah Jones." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the reporters. "Dr. Finch has called Elias a charlatan, his mother a quack. He has questioned my stability. Let me be clear. Dr. Finch is a man whose considerable ego was bruised when my daughter Lily began to show improvement under Elias's care, something Dr. Finch and his colleagues had failed to achieve for 3 years." A murmur went through the crowd. It is true, Richard continued, that Elias's methods are unconventional. They are rooted in a wisdom passed down from his mother, a wisdom born of compassion and a deep connection to the natural world. A wisdom that this city, and perhaps my own company, has too often ignored in communities like the one Sarah Jones served. He then spoke of Zone 7. He didn't make excuses. He acknowledged the reports, the past failures of oversight within one of his subsidiaries, and pledged a full, transparent investigation and substantial long-term investment into the health and revitalization of that community personally overseen by him. It was a stunning admission, a calculated risk that could cost him dearly. As for my daughter, Richard's voice softened his eyes, finding Lily. For 3 years I watched her fade. Elias Jones, this poor boy, this supposed charlatan, has given her back her smile. He has given her back her spirit. He has reminded her legs of their song. He turned to Lily. "Lily, darling, Elias is here. I am here. Can you show them?" All eyes turned to the small girl. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant city sounds and the frantic clicking of cameras. Elias knelt beside her, whispering something only she could hear. He held her hands. Lily looked at her father, then at Elias. A look of profound trust, of quiet determination, settled on her small face. Slowly, with an effort that was visible in the tightening of her small shoulders, she pushed against the armrests of her wheelchair. Elias's hands were there, not lifting, but steadying, offering silent support. Richard's heart was in his throat, and then Lily Sterling stood. Her legs trembled, her body swayed precariously, but she was on her own 2 feet, standing. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Richard felt tears stinging his eyes. She held Elias's gaze, then her father's. A radiant smile, brighter than any Richard had seen in years, illuminated her face. And then she took a step. One hesitant, shaky, miraculous step. Then another. And a third. Before she wobbled and reached out, not in a fall, but with the instinct of a child taking her first, independent strides towards her father. Richard caught her, lifting her into his arms, tears streaming down his face, oblivious to the cameras, to the stunned silence that had now erupted into a cacophony of shouts and flashes. He held his daughter, his walking, smiling daughter, and looked over her head at Elias Jones, the boy who had nothing and who had given them everything. The price of belief, Richard realized, was sometimes facing the ugliest truths about oneself. But the reward was immeasurable. The press conference and Lily's miraculous steps sent shockwaves through the city. The initial media frenzy was a chaotic mix of awe, disbelief, and cynical speculation. Some outlets hailed it as a modern-day miracle, lauding Richard Sterling's courage and the enigmatic boy, Elias Jones. Others, particularly those aligned with more conservative financial and medical establishments, hinted at mass hysteria, a desperate father's elaborate stunt, or even exploitation. Dr. Alistair Finch, though publicly silent after Richard's explosive dismissal, worked furiously behind the scenes, trying to salvage his reputation by painting Richard as unhinged and Elias as a dangerous unknown. But the image of Lily Sterling standing smiling, taking those first defiant steps, was a powerful antidote to the cynicism. It was a story that resonated deeply, a David and Goliath narrative with a child's fragile hope at its center. For Richard, the days that followed were a blur of meetings, with his shaken board of directors, with his equally stunned legal team, and with a growing number of community leaders from Zone 7 and beyond who had heard his pledge. The board, after a tense and lengthy emergency session, where Richard laid out not just his plans for Lily and Elias, but his stark realizations about Sterling Industries' past conduct in Zone 7, had reluctantly agreed to support him. His candor, his willingness to investigate his own company, and the undeniable PR nightmare of ousting a CEO whose daughter had just experienced a miracle had tipped the scales, for now. But the true battle, Richard knew, was internal. In the quiet solitude of his study, no longer a command center of corporate conquest, but a crucible of self-revelation, he wrestled with the man he had been. He replayed his life, not as a series of triumphs, but as a sequence of choices, each one leading him further away from the core of his own humanity. His relentless drive, his obsession with control, his casual dismissal of anything that didn't fit his rigid worldview. It all seemed so hollow now, so utterly pointless in the face of Lily's smile, in the quiet wisdom of Elias's gaze. He remembered his initial assessment of Elias, a street urchin, an absurdity. Good God, he thought, a wry, self-deprecating grimace, twisting his lips. I was a pompous ass. A highly successful, globally recognized pompous ass. The humor, if it could be called that, was bitter, but it was also cleansing. He saw with painful clarity how his wealth and power had insulated him, not just from hardship, but from essential truths about connection, about vulnerability, about the simple, unquantifiable value of a human heart. His choc loi, his atonement, could not be a token gesture. It had to be real, systemic. The investigation into Zone 7 was already underway with an independent oversight committee he himself had appointed. But he knew it needed more. He envisioned the Sarah Jones Community Wellness Initiative, not just a clinic, but a holistic center that embraced both conventional and traditional healing arts that provided nutritional support, education, and, most importantly, dignity to a community long neglected. It would be a testament to Sarah's quiet legacy and a constant reminder to Richard of the true meaning of strength. Within Sterling Industries, he began to draft a new corporate charter, one that embedded social and environmental responsibility into its very DNA, not as a PR exercise, but as a fundamental operating principle. There was resistance, of course. Old habits died hard, especially when profits were at stake. But Richard, armed with his newfound clarity, was more formidable than ever. And then there was Elias, the boy who had, in his quiet way, dismantled Richard's world and then helped him rebuild it on a truer foundation. Richard formally petitioned for guardianship, a move that felt less like a legal process and more like an affirmation of a bond that had already been forged in the crucible of shared hope and pain. Elias, settling into the vastness of Sterling Manor, observed his new surroundings with a child's curiosity, but also with that unnerving old soul wisdom. He found the sheer number of rooms baffling. Mr. Durr, Sterling, he'd asked one evening as Richard showed him the expansive library, does one person really need so many places to sit and read the same books? Richard, who once would have explained it in terms of asset diversification or architectural grandeur, found himself simply saying, "Probably not, Eli. Probably not." The boy's presence was a constant, gentle corrective. When Richard found himself slipping into old patterns of impatience or autocratic command, a quiet look from Elias, or a simple, disarmingly direct question would pull him back. He was learning to listen, truly. Listen not just to Elias, but to the quieter voices within himself he had silenced for so long. Lily, of course, was the radiant center of this new universe. Her progress was steady, a daily unfolding of small miracles. She was walking now with increasing confidence, her laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for too long. She adored Elias, her magic brother, as she called him, and their bond was a source of constant joy for Richard. He found himself spending hours simply watching them, Lily chattering animatedly, as Elias showed her how to identify different bird songs, or patiently helped her with the exercises that were slowly, surely strengthening her legs. The reactions from Richard's former world were as expected mixed. Some long-time associates, men and women of substance, reached out with quiet words of support, admitting their own disillusionment with a world built solely on acquisition. Others, like Dr. Finch, remained embittered. Finch, after Richard's press conference, and several pointed questions from the medical board regarding his conduct and his apparent misdiagnosis of Lily's potential for recovery, had quietly resigned from his prestigious post, his reputation significantly tarnished. He faded from public view, a casualty of his own hubris. Richard didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in Finch's downfall, only a quiet affirmation that truth, however unconventional, had a power of its own. His focus was on the future, on the difficult, demanding, yet profoundly rewarding path of rebuilding, not just Lily's strength or a neglected community, but his own soul. He knew the journey was far from over. The habits of a lifetime were not undone in a matter of weeks. There would be setbacks, doubts, moments, when the old Richard Sterling, the ruthless, anhedonic boss, would try to reassert himself. But now he had an anchor. He had Lily's laughter, Elias's steady gaze, and the enduring, humbling memory of a boy with duct-taped shoes who had reminded him how to believe. The price had been high, his conscience stripped bare, his old certainties shattered. But what he was building in their place, he knew, was infinitely more valuable. 2 years. 2 years can feel like an eternity or the blink of an eye. For Richard Sterling, it had been both. An eternity of unlearning, of dismantling the fortress of his old self, and a blink measured in the astonishing speed of Lily's recovery, in the quiet blossoming of Elias, into a confident, articulate young man. The Sarah Jones Community Wellness Initiative, built on the once blighted land adjacent to Zone 7, was now a vibrant hub of activity. It wasn't just a clinic, it was a sanctuary. Bright murals painted by local artists adorned its walls. A community garden flourished, providing fresh produce. Children's laughter echoed from a newly built playground. The initiative offered a blend of conventional medical checkups, nutritional counseling, mental health support, and workshops dedicated to the gentle nature-based healing practices Sarah Jones had championed. Richard had poured not just his money, but his time, his very soul into making it a reality. He was there several times a week, not as the boss, but as Richard, a volunteer, a listener, a learner. His tailored suits often gathered dust, now replaced by more comfortable practical clothes, suitable for kneeling in the garden or reading stories to children in the initiative's bright, airy common room. He'd even developed a surprising knack for untangling kite strings, a skill that earned him more genuine admiration from the local children than any multi-billion-dollar merger ever had. His old corporate colleagues, some of them still didn't quite understand the transformation. They'd see him occasionally at industry events he was now obliged to attend and murmur about his eccentric philanthropy. Richard would just smile. They didn't know the half of it. The real profit he'd discovered wasn't measured in quarterly earnings, but in the warmth of a child's trusting hand, in the quiet dignity of a community reclaiming its health and hope. Sterling Industries had changed, too. The new charter, with its emphasis on ethical practices and community partnership, was more than just words on paper. It had led to tangible shifts, cleaner manufacturing processes, fair wage initiatives, and a genuine commitment to employee well-being. Profits had dipped slightly at first, causing some jitters on the board, but then something unexpected happened. Employee morale soared. Innovation, driven by a renewed sense of purpose, flourished. Sterling Industries, against all cynical predictions, began to thrive in a new, more sustainable way. Richard, it turned out, was an even better boss when his heart was leading the way. Lily, now a vibrant 10-year-old, was the embodiment of that thriving. She not only walked, she ran, she danced, she climbed trees with an agility that still brought tears to Richard's eyes. Her laughter was the constant, joyful soundtrack of Sterling Manor. The shadows were gone, replaced by an infectious zest for life. She had a quick wit and a compassionate heart, often accompanying Richard and Elias to the Sarah Jones Initiative, her easy charm making her a favorite among the children there. She loved to tease her father. "Dad," she'd said one Saturday morning, as Richard, covered in mud from an enthusiastic but ultimately futile attempt to fix a leaking bird bath, trudged into the kitchen. "You know, for a man who used to run a global empire, you're surprisingly terrible at plumbing. Eli, can you explain to him again that water generally flows downhill?" Elias, now 12, looked up from the schematics of a solar-powered irrigation system he was designing for the community garden, a project for his advanced science class. He wore simple, clean clothes, his old duct-taped boots long since replaced, though his preference for function over fashion remained. A thoughtful smile played on his lips. Actually, Lily missed her. Sterling's understanding of fluid dynamics in that particular instance was creatively ambitious. Richard chuckled, ruffling Lily's hair. All right. I surrender to the combined genius in this room. Breakfast, anyone?" This easy banter, this warmth was the new normal, a peace so profound it sometimes felt like a dream. Elias was Richard's legal ward and more truly his son. He was excelling in his studies, his keen intellect absorbing knowledge like a sponge, yet he never lost that quiet, grounded wisdom that had first drawn Richard to him. He hadn't, as Richard had once secretly feared, become jaded or overly impressed by the wealth that now surrounded him. His greatest joy was still found in simple things, a problem solved, a person helped, a quiet hour spent in nature. He was already a mentor himself at the initiative, patiently teaching younger children the principles his mother had taught him, blending them seamlessly with the science he was now mastering. He still checked in on Richard's posture. "You're slouching a little, Mr. Sterling," he'd say gently during their evening chess games. "Remember what Mama Sarah said about the spine being the river of life." Richard would straighten up a smile, touching his lips. One crisp autumn afternoon, the three of them, Richard, Lily, and Elias, were at the Sarah Jones Initiative's annual fall festival. The air was filled with music, laughter, and the scent of roasting corn. Lily was helping a group of smaller children paint pumpkins, her face alight with joy. Elias was explaining his new irrigation system to a group of impressed local farmers. Richard stood back watching them. He wasn't the boss here. He wasn't the billionaire philanthropist. He was just Richard, a father, a guardian, a man who had been given a second chance to understand what truly mattered. The scars of his past, the memory of his old arrogance and despair were still there, but they no longer defined him. They were reminders etched into his soul of the journey he had taken, of the grace he had been shown. An elderly woman from the community, Mrs. Henderson, whose chronic cough had miraculously eased since the initiative had helped clean up a nearby stream, approached him, a warm apple cider in her hand. She would have been so proud, you know, Mrs. Henderson said, softly, nodding towards a simple plaque bearing Sarah Jones's name. Your Sarah, and your boy Elias. He has her same spirit. Richard's throat tightened. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, she would. And he does. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festive scene, Lily ran up to him, her cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkling. Elias joined them a moment later, a contented look on his face. Best festival ever, Dad, Lily declared, throwing her arms around his waist. It certainly is, sweetheart. Richard agreed, his arm around her, his other hand resting on Elias's shoulder. He looked at these two children, one his by birth, the other by a bond forged in the unlikeliest of circumstances, and a profound sense of peace settled over him. It wasn't the triumphant, conquering peace of a business deal, sealed, but a deeper, quieter resonance. An earned peace. The journey had been arduous, the lessons painful, but here, surrounded by the tangible evidence of hope, rebuilt and lives touched, Richard Sterling finally understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't in the steel and glass towers or the figures on a balance sheet. It was here, in the warmth of his daughter's hug, in the steady, wise gaze of the boy who had saved them all, in the quiet, persistent song of the human heart, finally remembering its way. In a world so quick to judge by appearances, the story of Elias, Lily, and Richard whispers a powerful truth. Hope can indeed bloom in the most barren of grounds, and true sight often requires us to look far beyond what our eyes first tell us. Isn't it often in those moments of deepest despair, when all conventional doors have closed, that we become truly open to the quiet miracles we might otherwise dismiss? We hope this journey of unexpected healing and hard-won redemption resonated with you as deeply as it did with us as we shared it. What for you was the most profound lesson from Elias's unwavering faith, or from Richard's ultimate transformative choice? We would be truly grateful to read your reflections in the comments below. And as we always strive to make our stories better and more meaningful, please do share any suggestions or ideas you might have for us. Your insights are invaluable as we continue to craft these narratives. If this story touched your heart, a simple like would mean the world, and if you feel its message might offer comfort or inspiration to someone else, please consider sharing it. To ensure you don't miss our future explorations into the depths of the human spirit, do subscribe and click that notification bell. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may you find warmth and wonder in the stories that unfold around you.